Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Gold Silver Bitcoin Show. We have a very special guest today, Foster Gamble. Foster, I think a lot of people are going to be familiar with your story. I first came across your work while you were creating the Thrive documentary and the whole, I guess, multimedia experience around that. So I suppose, can you perhaps tell us where that began and where it's gone since and where it is today?
When I was graduating from college back in 1970, I thought the world was on a pretty good trajectory. People were becoming aware of environmental problems and people were doing humanitarian work throughout the world. It seemed like the world was waking up. And then the more I got out into the world, the more I realized, no, wait a minute, it's actually going the other direction in so many unfortunate ways. And I remember saying to my friends in college that I wanted to make a film about what's in the way of humanity thriving and what we can do about it. And some of my friends were engineers, and they said that'd be great because someday we're going to have a global instantaneous information delivery system. And the notion kind of blew my mind is, okay, you guys are the engineers. I don't know how you're going to do that, but I'll work on having some meaningful content to do justice to a system like that. And, you know, here we are. So I thought that I always wanted to make that film, and I thought it might take 10 years or so to really have a sense of what's in the way of our thriving and what we can do about it. Well, 42 years later, I was finally ready to actually start on the film, because what was in the way of our thriving was way deeper and worse than I thought. And I didn't want to put the film out until it represented potential solutions that were commensurate to the problem. So we spent 8 years making the film. We launched it in late November in 2011. And we didn't know if anybody was going to be ready for it or not, because we made 68 kind of outrageous claims, but you know, it was fully fact checked and all that. So we just didn't know if people were going to be ready for this diagnosis of what was going on really behind the scenes with humanity. But we had a 700-seat auditorium that sold out in 20 minutes at 6 a.m. We put it out in 10 languages that same day. And it went completely viral and went on to become the most widely seen feature documentary in history now. So the great news about that is that it showed us that humanity is not only to a great extent able to take a lot of truth, they're actually really hungry for it so that they can actually go about solving the problems in ways that really work. So that was the story of Thrive One.
And around that time it came out, I went to an event, United We Stand, in Los Angeles. And and I know that you were there with your wife, and actually you and your wife, Kimberly, and Jeff Berwick and Luke Radowski, as well as a young woman who would go on to become my wife, actually all went to lunch there. And then in, I believe, like May of 2020, actually, just by complete chance, I ended up going sailing too with your son through mutual friends, or actually through my my wife's father who does sailing.
Wow, in San Diego?
In San Diego.
Oh, that's very interesting.
So I remember that I guess that was around 20, I actually think it was a 2014 when we were at that event. And you mentioned that people ended up being prepared for that documentary. What observations could you make about the people who were prepared at that time for this type of information and documentary and were receptive?
Well, what we've noticed is that you don't necessarily have to have a lot of background in this type of stuff. What it takes is more a commitment to critical thinking, a commitment to the truth, and then some emotional maturity. Because if you think the government is going to take care of everything and the pharmaceuticals are going to heal you and the Federal Reserve is going to stabilize the global economy and so forth, you know, that's a very relaxing series of thoughts. But as that worldview begins to come crashing down, it's very challenging, because all of a sudden, you know, you're out there on your own. And it can feel very lonely at first. Fortunately, then you begin to meet a lot of other people. There's literally hundreds of millions people around the world now who have woken up to, okay, how does this world really work, and how would I like it to work for my grandchildren? So I think that being ready for this information is as much a function of how mature are you as a person. You know, have you done some meditation? Have you done some therapy? Have you had a spiritual discipline and so forth to prepare yourself for actually seeking the truth as your top priority, rather than just being comfortable with an old paradigm or staying secure in your particular social or political set?
It reminded me of something I heard Mr. Rogers say just this morning. Just a quick clip. It was something along the lines of that he thinks we're becoming too information obsessed, and that he wants to work to ensure that people keep their sense of wonder, especially children. And also, he said that he wanted them to have a capacity for self-reflection. And I think some of the stuff you mentioned, therapy, et cetera, shows a capacity for self-reflection, and then wonder, and wonder about how the world is or might be, is also a big ingredient here. You can't just necessarily look at data and facts, it seems, and maybe string together a whole worldview or philosophy even. And this is something I think Niels Bohr said. Niels Bohr was a scientist, and he said that essentially, like, he studied science, he was in the data his whole life, and it ultimately led him to where religion began. And so that science led him to a personal God. And so this ability of self-reflection, and then what, you know, what it means to be a good person, who do I want to be, what do I want to put out in the world, and ultimately having the capacity to dream big and follow those dreams. I think, as you said, maturity was a word you brought up, and I'll say it also like makes life so much more enjoyable as
Well, I
well.
love that you brought that up. And it's actually an entree into talking a little bit about Thrive too, because one of the most exciting things in my life has been that as I have grown older and hopefully a little wiser, what's happened is the principles of science that I've been studying my entire life, and then the principles of ethics and morality, which I became more interested in later in life, have actually finally come together into one. And I realized that they are actually one and the same. Once you come to the truth about the scientific principles, you realize that, of course, they're simply a reflection of how reality works. So when you're looking at the human side, when you're looking at the moral side of how can humanity live harmoniously, it's of course according to those exact same principles. So in Thrive 2, we really did a deep exploration, I think the deepest exploration ever in film, of the unified field. And I've been working for over 20 years with an advanced physicist named Nassim Haramein. And he, I believe, has finally solved the riddle that Einstein spent his life on. Is, you know, what is a coherent unified field theory? Is there a perspective from which all of the known so-called separate forces of electricity, magnetism, gravity, and the strong and weak nuclear forces, we call them different things, but, you know, we live in a unified reality. This is one reality. So Einstein knew that. Einstein was really committed to that sense of awe that you're talking about. And he was doggedly after solving this problem all his life, and he didn't get it. And he actually said reportedly that if someone someday does get it, it'll be because they're steeped in geometry, not just mathematics. And both Nassim and I have spent our entire lives steeped in nature's geometry. And that has been a major key to, Nassim allowed us to reveal, kind of do a trailer for his unified field theory, which is about to be published probably in January or February of 2023. And it makes total sense in a very simple, common sense way of how all of reality, including these so-called separate forces, fit together as simply different aspects of a unified picture. And besides geometry, Einstein and other physicists have been missing that the universe is holographic, that the universe is fractal, and that the universe is both alive and conscious, because you need to have all of those key ingredients plus the geometry and the math to actually reflect back how the whole thing works. But that's what we do in Thrive too. If anybody is listening to this and hasn't seen it, I highly recommend you go to thriveon.com, and both of our films are there. I think you'll find them super entertaining and really life-changing.
The Holographic Universe is a book I read many years ago. Of course, I haven't brushed up on it in a while, but I always constantly think about like the system that we live in and how much of it is just, kind of springed from our thoughts and imaginations, how we are essentially like, I guess trapped is really the way that I would put it. We go to public school and we're kept in a reality there. And a lot of people think that the public school system needs more money. And when I look back on it, it was a very small, tiny little reality that you were kept in. Everyone acknowledged that it was no fun. And that's kind of, I think, at one level or one layer of kind of reality, that is where one hologram, sort of the system, if you will, was kind of like, we're introduced or brought into it. And some people call it a cult. They'll note that like the dominant culture, it's kind of cult-like. But I think also one way of looking at it is that there's just this hologram that we created where we've given these certain entities or people in certain roles so much power over the collective, really.
Well, in Thrive 2, we go into a bunch of the problems and kind of where we are and our progress on them. And then we do an analysis to go right to the core. It's like, okay, what's wrong with this? Because my wife and I traveled all over the world for years after Thrive 1. We were contacted by over 1,000 innovators and inventors. So we spent years finding out who had what and what was real. And it was so mind-blowingly encouraging that that's when we decided to make Thrive 2. And so in Thrive 2, we show multiple healers who have very real cures for cancer. And we show people who have ethical philosophies that can actually work for the entire world. We have energy devices which are clean and inexpensive and pull energy right out of the plenum of space itself. So all of this, and it's true in every sector, environmentally, agriculturally, these problems have actually already been solved. And that was such good news that we had to get that word out to the world. Now, the bad news is, and of course we represented in the film, is that these doctors who are curing cancer, 3 out of 4 of them are hiding in other countries after assassination attempts on their lives. Same thing for the free energy inventors, because many of them have been taken out or they've been threatened or gag ordered, so that they have had to stop their work. And it just goes on in every sector. So why is that? Why don't we have access to these miraculous human creative developments? Well, it's because, in my analysis, that there have been 2 really fundamental cons in the history of humanity. And the first one is authority. We have all been conned into thinking that someone should be ruling over us. In fact, we want someone to rule over us because they'll take care of security and economy, and they'll take care of us, mommy and daddy forever. Well, the notion of one person ruling over another is actually pretty bizarre. If you and I were sitting down, Justin and Foster are sitting down to create the new universe. Well, I don't think we'd start by saying, okay, let's have a small group of people who will be able to rule over everybody else. That's probably not going to work out really well. But that's what we got conned into. And the public school system is a part of that indoctrination to keep people believing in the power of the state, and we should give over our freedom to them. So once somebody's got the power of authority, then what are they going to do next? Well, they're going to make laws to keep them in power. So anything that challenges that power is sedition or treason or whatever. Next thing they're going to do is, okay, well, if people start to object, we're in trouble. So we've got to be able to not only threaten them, we need to be able to buy them off. So we've got to control money ourselves. So let's create a centralized system. We'll call it the federal. So it sounds like it's the government, but it's actually a privatized collusion of the central banks and the government. And that's how they took over money itself in 1913 in the US. And since that time, the value of the dollar has decreased close to 99%, and it's going the rest of the way right now. I know that you have a lot of expertise in this area, but just for your audience, that wasn't an accident. That was an intentional takeover. So those two basic cons, authority and money, if you can get people to believe in that, then a small group of people have the potential, at least they believe, of ruling the world. And that's in the situation that we're in right now.
The US has, over the course of my life, and really I think the course of your life too, it's starting in the post-World War II era, gotten a bad reputation. Even though I think the ideas at the founding of this country are some of the most intellectually stimulating in the history of Western philosophy, and a lot of it goes with not having a man have the power over us from the government or whomever, but rather endowed in all of us as individuals from a God. And that, I think, is regardless of what you think or whether or not you believe in a God or a Christian God, that idea, I think, was a very nuanced decision in the course of writing the founding documents, as were some of the other ones of splitting up the authority, of having the checks and balances, having the states, which is a division of power that we've really seen play out over the last 2 years in particular, and still today. But to bring it back to kind of some of the founding ideas of the United States, what are your history with these ideas? For instance, I think we're often taught that they are kind of not so special. However, just because of my personal wonder, I ultimately stumbled on them in such a way where I thought they were fascinating and valuable. What's your personal history with the ideals of this country?
Well, it's interesting because I have the great privilege to be talking on a daily basis with people from all over the world. And I asked them, a lot of them, I've asked them, well, so what do you think of the United States? And basically what I get from most countries is, we don't give a damn about the United States, but we love America. And I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? And they said, what we love was the idea, the founding idea was really historic, that each person would be a sovereign being. And that was the beginning of heaven on earth. Of course, it's been distorted over time, even from the beginning. There are several flaws. The Declaration of Independence was pretty good. There's some major flaws in the Constitution, which say that you can challenge the government, but only to replace them with another government. And one of the reasons why I was thrilled to be invited on your podcast is that your conversations operate from a free market perspective that I think is the key to the success of humanity, not just in the market, but universally. I think that the major thing that we have been missing as a species throughout history is a universal morality. It used to be whoever had the biggest club and the biggest gang, they set the rules. And then the church came along, and that was a huge improvement, because whether it was Judaism, Islam, Christianity, whatever, every major religion has some sense of ethics at the core. Not necessarily thorough or great, but at least they're trying to enshrine some ethics about human behavior. But they all disagree about what was God's word, so they fought the Crusades and fought each other for centuries, and killed each other in the hundreds of millions. And then came along the state with the notion of the rule of law. And again, it was a huge advancement for humanity. But each state disagrees with other states about what are the right ethics to base the law on. So the states then end up warring with each other, and even within the state, in the 20th century alone, there were over 200 million murders within national boundaries by the governments of those countries. So we're not exactly at, peace and harmony in the world, but the church and the state were major steps in progress. In Thrive 2, I quote Martin Luther King when he said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." And I think he's very accurate. You go back to the pharaohs with all their slaves, and then you had the kings with their subjects, and then you had the dictators, and we've come a long way to a sense of democracy with premiers and prime ministers and presidents and so forth. But they have duped us into thinking that we have arrived, and we haven't. That arc of the moral universe was from complete subjugation to complete sovereignty. But we're not there. Democracy, even if we had honest elections, even if we had, enlightened leaders and so forth, it would still be at best mob rule, where 51% would rule over the other 49%. Is that necessary? Is that the best we can do? And has it worked throughout history? No, it's a big improvement, but it's definitely not working, and it's threatening our very existence as a species. So for me, what we have been missing is this core universal morality. And I think the best expression of that is in what's called the non-aggression principle, which simply states that no one is allowed to initiate force or fraud against anyone else except in true self-defense if you're being threatened. It sounds so simple, and everybody thinks that they agree with that because it sounds moral, but then they turn right around and vote for a democracy or a dictator or whatever it is, and we're right back where we started again. So the challenge of this universal morality is that if you apply the non-aggression principle universally, which a universal morality you would need to, then the natural application of that universally would lead to a stateless society, a society without an authoritarian government, a society of voluntary exchange and voluntary relationships. And whenever that has been tried throughout history, it results in the most prosperity, the most security, and the most happiness of any approach. But immediately the predators will come in and they will try to take over the wealth that gets created in a free market and so forth. And they try to, grab the wealth for themselves, socialize the losses. And now there's this global attempt at basically a global communist, fascist, technocratic one world government. And this could be the greatest disaster in human history because, who's going to save us from that? If it's global, we are in real trouble. And I don't know if we can count on extraterrestrials. I think some of them are out there and I think they're trying to help, but we can't count on them. We need to figure this out ourselves. So the alternative is actually moving toward more and more and more individual sovereignty. And that comes with individual accountability. So nobody is hiding behind government immunity or corporate immunity. Everybody is liable for the results of their actions. And I think that it's actually growing in every sector naturally, but most people still don't even understand that as a beacon for humanity's trajectory.
We've seen a clear shift in the conversation on the planet starting of March 2020 till now. So if I date back, say 2008 to 2010, so 2008, the global financial crisis, that's when I was like, what's going on here? The banks just got $1 trillion bailout. I don't even know how many zeros that is. Right. And back then that was like a new number too in governments, was $1 trillion.
That used to be a lot.
So then I figured out, okay, so this was like a wealth confiscation and the people had no choice. And there's a big mess on this planet's hands. And it starts with the central banks, from what I understand as well. And also some family dynasties as well, from my understanding. But the free market you mentioned, and this is like a dirty word these days in many ways. And again, this is kind of the impression I got while I was being raised in the public school system, who thought the public school system doesn't really rise up the free market. In fact, my economics course was a mess in high school. Luckily, I kind of did my own economics course later in life. But so the idea of free market.
That's just what I did too, by the way.
Yeah.
It's the one course, and I was a very good in academics, but the one course I ever flunked was Economics 101. And because it made no sense to me. I knew I was being indoctrinated. I had to memorize enough to finally pass the exam, but I just abandoned traditional economics and then went after, okay, what's really going on here?
And I think a lot of the basic, like true basic economics, where there's a discipline that really values the individual, it really values human action. It believes that like the economy is basically like given animation through individuals, that a society can arrive at better decision making when individuals in their own neighborhoods, et cetera, come to decisions that are best for them, as opposed to having a a small clan of people at the center making the decisions for everyone. I started going to city councils regularly, and one of the first things that jumped out at me was that there's this they have an axiom essentially where they have enough data or information in order to make the best decisions for the group. This plays out a lot in planning. So the zoning and planning and building homes and or building stores, et cetera, they essentially go in and they think, oh, this part of town is going to be best for retail, and this part of town is going to be best for uh, residential. Uh, And while Houston has lots of regulations around zoning and planning, it does not have zoning regulations. And they found that things kind of end up where you would expect them to end up.
Right.
So Walter Block argues you don't find big billboards in a small residential street because nobody's driving down that street. So nobody puts a billboard there.
Right.
But when you go to these city council meetings, they largely believe that they have the training and then also the data to make decisions, when really I think things would play out at least similar, if not perhaps more efficient, if they weren't involved. And that's like the main thing that's hilarious at city council meetings, is that they kind of just they just kind of like throw things at the wall and they're like, that looks good there, we'll throw in a residential area there. Now you mentioned universal morality, and at one of these city council meetings, I go to a city council in Washington State in Spokane, and it's a mess. Spokane has so many issues, drug issues, economic issues. They have a shortfall, but yeah, it's beautiful because people go there from all walks of life, homeless people, well-to-do people, and then they all yell at city council, and we all hug it out. City council lets them yell at them, and then they're like, "Thank you so much." But one woman there recently, who's there every week, she said, you don't have to believe in God to receive his blessings. You only have to follow his laws, which are orderly, she said. And these laws are the ethics and the ethics that are kind of laid out in the 10 Commandments. And I thought that was a nice moment there where with so much division, where she was said, if you don't believe in God, that's fine. You just have to live morally.
Yeah. Well, imagine if we could get people to agree on a moral code. I mean, it's hard to get people to agree in your own family on where to go for dinner, much less get the 7.8 billion people to agree on an ethic. But you know what, Justin, in my travels all over the world over the last 15 years, the one thing that I have found that everybody agrees to is they don't want to be violated against their will. So voila, maybe we don't have to make up anything. Maybe nature has been showing us all along what is the core ethic that we can base our laws around. And I think that that's what's emerging right now. It's just that there's a lot of people in power who don't want to lose that power over other people. So they will censor on the internet, or they will suppress medical cures, or they'll suppress improvements in energy and so forth, because they want to use those sectors in order to maintain their power over people. But I think all of that's getting exposed now. And I think that not only is this the riskiest time in human history because of the nuclear weapons, biological, chemical weapons with which we can destroy ourselves pretty quickly, but it's also, we have the technology to connect just like this all over the world instantaneously, and good news could spread as fast as fake news has. And I think that humanity can actually turn this around and align with the natural principles faster than we can almost imagine. And I think I think we're literally at that turning point right now.
So universal morality, it reminds me of this debate that took place in the 50s and 60s between like the Skinnerist camp and of behavioral psychologists, and then the Chomsky, and where Skinner basically said we had no capacity for language. We were born and we learned as blank slates how to speak. But Chomsky said that there was an innate capacity for human language in humans across culture, and that we had like built-in grammatical structures in our brain, I guess, in the language center of our brain. I agree with you that we have built-in universal morality, that we have we must have an ethics or moral center in our brain, and perhaps the governments just don't pay to have that studied.
Yeah, they pay to not have it studied because they would go out of business very quickly if people wake up and realize that not only could they be free sovereign beings, but things would work way better if people are individually liberated and at the same time accountable.
So this kind of dichotomy between centralizing forces and individuals pushing back and trying to maintain freedom and liberty, I think has been going on forever, for all of recorded history. It's the human condition. It's I also often think of it as the never-ending story. There's a quote you mentioned something that reminded me of the quote. It was the best of times and it was the worst of times. Like, I guess every single day I become more aware of this never-ending story, this battle, I guess, in part our purpose on earth of essentially like of being human. We have a mandate from nature or God or whomever or whatever to be human. And there's forces that are trying to stop that clearly. And on the way that it's appearing today, we've got king gods at the beginning of Western civilization, and then it was the king and the queens, and then we had prime ministers, presidents, military dictators mixed in as well. And now it seems the attempt is like the Borg, where our machines just tell us what to do, and there is no leader, and we're just kind of being pushed by our technology.
Well, yeah, this is what I was referring to before about this technocratic one world government approach, because, of course, it's been the dream of psychopathic dictators forever to rule everything as far as they can see and everyone, but it's never been feasible before. And now the same psychopathic predators are looking at the advancements in technology and realizing, oh, here's a possible path to complete world domination. We've got the technology to do total surveillance. We'll get everybody chipped so that we can not only track them, but we can influence their thinking, influence their emotions. We'll get a social credit score so that we're scoring everyone not on their ethical behavior, but on their compliance with the dictates of the state. And then if they don't comply, we can cut off their bank account. We can cut off their ability to travel, participate in social discourse, and so forth. And so the technocrats have this dream that if they can turn it over basically to machines, then they actually will be able to dominate all human beings through technology. And some of them want to just rule that technology which rules the world. Some of them, the so-called transhumanists, actually want to end human civilization and either upload our consciousness into the digital realm or just get rid of humans entirely and just move to some sort of eternal silicon-based existence. And it's a very, very dangerous and tragic perspective. I've talked with some of the real leaders in that field, and they don't lack for intelligence and they don't lack for money, but they do lack for wisdom and awareness of the true nature of a human being. Every single one of them was of the belief that our consciousness is simply a random epiphenomenon of the molecular movement in the gray matter of our brain. None of them recognized the conscious nature of the unified field, the conscious nature of human evolution, of all of evolution. And because of that, they end up, each one of them was a very, very afraid person, scared to death of dying, guilty that they couldn't heal their father before they died. Ray Kurzweil had his father cryogenically frozen because he wants to bring him back by 2029 and so forth. There's a desperation in their personal stories that shows a lack of the essential nature that we have cells and we have molecules inside the cells and we have atoms inside of that. But if you keep going down in there, there's nothing there. It's just whirlpools in a sea of energy. And so by definition, these trillions of cells in my body are being held together by some sort of metaphysical consciousness, because all those cells have been replaced in the last 7 years, and yet Foster's been here all along. So I think the way I would sum this up, one of the main messages I'm trying to get out to humanity is the controlling technocrats want to take us to the digital singularity to end humanity and turn us over to robots. What I think our individual and our species calling is toward not a technological singularity, but a humanitarian singularity. And what I mean by that is there will be a point in time, if we take the correct fork in the road, where we will actually be sufficiently mature and wise as a species that we will be living harmoniously with each other and with the environment and with entities from other dimensions, other planets, other galaxies, whatever it is. We will have organized around the non-aggression principle, and we will be using artificial intelligence for the conscious benefit of humanity, but always in a voluntary way, rather than not only being used by it, but ultimately turning ourselves over to it. And to me, that feels like what my spirit is being called to. That's what I think every human spirit that hasn't been really damaged and distorted is being called toward accomplishing that rather than giving up.
What damaged the technocrats' spirit? Because the flaw in their thinking is clear as day. You mentioned dangerous. What they're doing is insanely dangerous. They are insane. But I guess my first, I have compassion for them because they're clearly missing something upstairs and here, and they're missing out on a part of human experience that is key to truly understanding it as well. And I wonder, does that have to do with their education growing up or what?
I think it's a really, really powerful question. And the best I can answer it at this point, it's a continuing question for me. It comes down to one word: abuse. I've looked into hundreds of biographies of not only the technocrats, but the top central bankers and the top warmongers and the heads of these various secret societies who are organizing the so-called Great Reset, the New World Order, whatever you want to call what we call the global domination agenda in our films. And I have not read a single biography yet of the real leaders in that group, of people who haven't gone through some sort of severe abuse, whether it was intentional abuse in order to dismantle their mind and reorganize it, as in so-called MK Ultra mind control, or whether it was just generational habit in these certain genealogies that you're talking about. I've known people from these families. I've known some of them quite well, and some of them are really good people, but some of them have really confided in me what has gone on, that from a very early age, basically the patriarch sits them down and said, well, son, here's the way the world works. There's people who rule and there's people who are ruled. Which do you want to be? And unless you go, oh, I want to be one of the rulers, and then do whatever they want for the rest of your life, then they will cast you out, or worse, or abuse you in order to change your mind so that you can be in the club that was destined to rule the world. So it really is, it's either conscious or habitual mind control that abuses a young soul in such a way that they lose touch with the power of truth and intimacy and honest communication and fundamentally love.
What would you say to one of these individuals to maybe show them the light? Yeah, if they were in front of you.
Well, it's interesting because I have had some of those conversations. One of them with one of the top transhumanists. This guy had written a book and he wanted a blurb from me. And I said, and he sent me the book, and I said, I can't imagine what I would say that would be positive about this book. And he says, well, I'd love you to write something. And I said, I don't think you really would, because I would just trash your whole premise. And he said, well, I'd like to come and visit and we'll talk it over. And this guy was one of the, academically most brilliant people on the entire planet. but he had really gone down the wrong rabbit hole. And so I had that conversation with him that I just referred to briefly about, because he was convinced that I said, well, who are you essentially? Who are you really? And he said, well, I'm just my body. That's it. So I took him on that little journey that I also represent in Thrive 2. We animate it to go down into the microscopic level where you realize that there are no things there. There's just energy whirling, being organized by some sort of metaphysical consciousness. And I saw his jaw drop, and he said, I've never had that thought before my entire life. And so we ended up talking for hours about, and I showed him the evidence of the reincarnation and of channeling and of intuition and psychic phenomena and so forth. And I wasn't just talking about some notion. I was showing him the evidence because I've studied that for decades. And at the end of that evening, to his credit, he shook my hand and he said, I think you've opened my mind. He said, this whole metaphysical thing, you may be onto something really big here. So that's the type of example that I would use on a less scientific level. I would ask someone, what are you really afraid of? And when did that start? Because, children who are treated well, they are living in that awe, and they're living in that curiosity about everything in life, and feeling the loving connection with their parents and their siblings and friends and all that kind of stuff. Well, what gets in the way of that? That's one of the biggest questions that I had to deal with in trying to make the first movie. And again, it simply came back to, I think that one of the major themes of what it will take to be living in a thriving civilization on a healthy planet is treating our children with love and respect. No spanking, no beating, no yelling, no screaming, no shunning, but learning how to sit down and negotiate with our own children, always honoring that limitless soul that they are, and then talking to that being all the time. Kimberly and I, we've never yelled at or screamed or punished or beat our kids, any of that type. It's not necessary, but it takes skills. Fortunately, each of us had parents who passed on those skills. But I think peaceful parenting is probably really the core thing that we need, along with all the science and the ethics and all that stuff. It comes back to applying the universal morality with the most vulnerable people on the planet, who are our children.
There's a bunch of people who didn't have parents that showed them the way, and that it's on them to stop that kind of cycle of abuse.
Yes.
And they can stop it for their entire family line forever. And that's a lot of power.
One of my favorite philosophers is a man named Stefan Molyneux. I don't know if you run across him, but he talks really beautifully about the power of peaceful parenting. And he's got such a response all over the world from his podcasts and so forth, that they started collecting some statistics, and the current estimates are over 250,000 families stopped the legacy of physical abuse in their families because of listening to his data and his logic about this. So that's the kind of, imagine if that were taught in schools. I used to teach harmonious communication in elementary schools, and I would warn the kids. I'd say, listen, you're going to be more sophisticated in accurate communication than your parents, so be patient with them when you go home. And they would come back and go, oh my God, you're right, my parents they're terrible communicators, they don't know how to do this stuff. But imagine when school involves teaching great communication and teaching fundamental philosophical principles and the non-aggression principle, as well as the basics of the unified field. We'll be in a completely different civilization when that's what we grow up with, instead of state indoctrination.
There's a song called Father of Mine. It was written by this band called Everclear in the 90s. It was a big hit. And still today on the YouTube channel, the comments are just everyone coming together around this song. The song's about a father who left very young, and the song's about the effect that had on the child. And the video is great. It takes the child through his life of like, he lives in a home with a picket fence, and then he's got to go live in a 1-bedroom apartment with his mom in a black neighborhood, and the guy's white, and this is a true story apparently. And then, falls into drugs, and then ultimately has a family of his own and stops the abuse. It's pretty much what the song and video is about. And the people that come together on this song, still to this day, many years later, you can see that the violent parenting has had a horrendous effect on our society. And it really stops. We can see it really starts, I think, with the system we live in. We could see since 2020, we're basically in an abusive relationship with a lot of our leaders. It's almost as if MK Ultra went like live at like a collective society. So I guess two questions are, do you have any comments on the abuse at the wider level society? And then my last question will be, what, through all your personal introspections, after you've kind of stumbled on the way of the world, what thoughts do you keep coming back to regularly?
Well, let me start with the abuse on a wider level. I firmly believe that it's no coincidence, this correlation that you have noticed between individual abuse and what's now happening in society. And one of the most profound conversations that I have ever been in was on my own show. Last year, I had Kathy O'Brien on. And Kathy O'Brien was probably the best known of the MK Ultra survivors. And she was, for 25 years, subjected to the most horrific treatment that human beings could even imagine doing to one another. And she is now, fortunately, she was rescued and then deprogrammed, and then just did years of healing under excellent guidance. And she's one of the most clear, powerful, radiant, loving beings that I have ever come across. And so, number one, it shows us that with the right kind of help, each of us could potentially heal from anything and everything. And number two, I asked her, after we talked personally, I said, because she was literally a White House level MK Ultra sex slave courier and assassin. So she was like in the rooms with a lot of these horrific so-called leaders, and she heard their conversations. So when I asked her if she thought the plan was to apply MK Ultra principles, which started in the Nazi prison camps, came to the CIA in the US, and she said it wasn't just a plan, it's already happening. It's exactly the same principles that are now being applied to society as a whole. So she's written a book called PTSD, I think, Healing from Trauma, where she coaches people on how to take how she healed and apply it in their personal life, but also how to apply it into our society, because that's the level of horror and the level of possibility that is there right now. It's very, very real.
So you mentioned that the abuse has led her to being radiant. And I think that's kind of a beautiful thing about reality, is that like people who are coming from these situations, if they are able to rise above it and work on themselves like they need to, which starts with being honest, and then starts with really wanting to change. And then probably from there starts with exploring and researching and figuring out what works for you, listening to other people that have been through similar experiences. It's like probably it's a lifelong probably struggle.
Yeah, I think each thing that you identified there is very accurate in terms of what it involves. And at the core of it is being in the safe presence of loving human beings, unconditionally loving. That each survivor that I've met who's in good shape had that for, minimum of a decade. I mean, it's a big deal.
Yeah. And so then the last thing that leads me, so the abuse led to her becoming a radiant person. And I feel like that's the issue that a lot of these people who want to control things have. So their surveillance system is essentially why, through their surveillance system, they're now surveilled. Also, they've created a Frankenstein system, which I think very likely could like turn against them even. And it could be their undoing.
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting dynamic that I don't hear people mention very often. I've been told by a very high level, very consistently trustworthy source, and I haven't fact checked it myself yet, but that Bitcoin was actually created by the CIA in Australia and then brought here and brought around the world. But whether that's true or not, let's say that that were true. In any case, I believe that it was one of those really brilliant developments that got out of hand in a really good way, and they can no longer control it. And I think it's the same thing with the internet, which was developed by DARPA originally, and then now we all get to benefit from it. It's one of the main battlegrounds for freedom, but thank God we've at least got what we do right now. And also, just in terms of people's lives, when you see the abuse, when you experience the abuse, then you know the contrast firsthand between love and coercion. And the similar things have happened with a lot of the types of lockdowns and mandates and so forth that have been going on recently. And I'm not going to go into depth on that at all, but just to say that one of the things that's happened during the COVID period is a lot of people are thinking more critically than they were before. A lot of people have had to lose friendships over disagreements on protocols and worldview and so forth. But I see individual creative thinkers landing again and again in relationships that were deeper than the old ones, relationships based on truth, freedom, and love, rather than on kowtowing to some old paradigm, or, do what I say, or don't talk about this, or say this, or, all of those types of commandments. So I think that one of the ways that the universe works is when there's a big pushback against the life force, and the global domination agenda is the biggest one ever on this planet. It's very dangerous, but at the same time, it accelerates the evolution of individual consciousness, and clarifies what we don't want, what doesn't feel good, what is not safe, and contrast that with what does feel really good, what nurtures your creativity, what nurtures your relationships. And ultimately, I believe that we will win this because we've got truth, we've got love, and we've got the life force on our side.
I see that playing out every day. And for the people, the global domination agenda, it's like very clear. It's in our media. It's everywhere. You can see the 007 movies. These are based on that premise, and it's very clear throughout them. Of course, those are made by big production houses, and they do have, I guess, a lot of different messages. But the original book by Ian Fleming, I believe, was essentially just to kind of highlight the global domination agenda. Then I watched a cartoon when I was young. I don't know how much I watched it, but it was around Pinky and the Brain. This whole thing was about two mice, and one of the mice's goal was world domination. It was a lab rat. The lab rat wanted world domination, and his sidekick was dumb and named Pinky, which I believe is a reference to being Pinko. There's one of the episodes entailed the way that the mouse wanted to get global domination is he wanted to found a third world country and then get US subsidies, and then take all the US subsidies and use it to take over the world. So like this global domination agenda, like it sounds crazy, and it is, but it's real and it's everywhere.
No, it goes back to Babylon and before. So it is, but I also want to, I really want to clarify that when you were talking about the perpetual story and so forth, this story has continued throughout history, but I do firmly observe that there is an arrow of time, there is an arc of evolution, and that I think that we are really going toward this humanitarian singularity where we will actually, in centuries in the future, if we make it as a species, they're going to be reading back in their, holographic tablets, and they're going to be going, Mom, Dad, did they really used to do this? They had a few people ruling. They were making up money themselves. They were putting people in prison if they did. Are you kidding? This is what they thought was going to work. And so I think it's becoming so blatantly obvious that we're at the fork in the road where people who are going down that authoritarian road they've got the free will to do that. But whenever they use that excuse to violate other people, the consequences are going to get more and more drastic. Those of us who are choosing the path of free will and sovereignty, honoring the sovereignty of every single individual, not only is it working, but what I see is it's a path of joy. It's a path of creativity. It's a path of love and human connection. So I think part of our challenge is to make sure we allow ourselves to be in that awe that you began the conversation with, and to enjoy ourselves and life and each other so much that people who were underinformed and went down that other route, they're still watching us. You know, they're looking across because they're still, it's still visible from that path. And if they're looking over and going, wait a minute, my world is all authority and fear and poverty and control and all this stuff, and they're over there having a great time, and they seem to be free, but no one's hurting each other. So if we can model thriving while we're in this challenging time, I think there may be no more powerful catalyst for those who are wanting to and are ready to change than to see people who are living it. And by the way, Justin, I one of the reasons I was excited to come on your show is I've watched a number of your interviews, and I think you embody that, you know, just in a quiet and humble way. You not only have the understanding that can lead our way out of this, but you embody that very sense of calm thriving. And I think it's a huge contribution. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking your time today. We've had the honor and privilege of sitting down with Foster Gamble. It's been a great conversation. It's going to be shared everywhere I can possibly share it. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. It's a delight.
And thank you everyone for listening.